afternoon and welcome to IBA News this Thursday, the 25th of August. I'm Elon Aslan-Levy, joining you live from Jerusalem. The search for survivors in the earthquake-struck towns of Amatrice, Accumoli and Pescatara del Tronto continued today, more than 36 hours after a 6.2 magnitude earthquake struck central Italy, killing at least 247 people and injuring dozens, with authorities expressing fears that the death toll will likely rise. Since yesterday's devastating quake, the region has been struck by a number of tremors, including a 4.5 magnitude aftershock early this morning. Thousands of emergency rescue teams using heavy lifting equipment and sniffer dogs searched for signs of life in the town of Amatrice, which was reduced to rubble, and in other towns that have suffered devastating damage after the quake struck in the regions of Umbria, Lazio and Marche before dawn yesterday, when most residents were still asleep. Across the country, Italians queued up to donate blood following an appeal by health authorities and the Red Cross. IsraAid, the Israeli humanitarian aid agency that responds to emergency crises around the world, is sending a team of 8 volunteers to Louisiana in the United States this weekend to assist victims of widespread floods. 13 people were killed in the flooding and 60,000 homes damaged, with more than 7,000 people in shelters after a prolonged torrential rainfall. The catastrophic flooding is being described as the worst natural disaster to strike the US since Hurricane Sandy 4 years ago. Shahar Zahavi, a spokesman for the agency, told IBA that volunteers will assist victims in salvaging their belongings and help gut the damaged homes so that they can be rebuilt with the assistance of the American government Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. Zahavi said IsraAid teams offer assistance across the world and not just in third world countries, noting that the agency's volunteers have assisted on numerous occasions in the United States and Canada in areas affected by hurricanes, floods and wildfires. Turkey's defense minister says that their forces, backed by Syrian rebels, have wrested control of Jarablus, one of the Islamic State's last strongholds on the Syrian frontier. But the incursion into northern Syria is really more about quashing the Kurds. More in this report from IBA's OSullivan.
Turkish troops backed by U.S. air support have pushed into northern Syria to knock out Islamic State. Over 20 tanks rolled over the border before dawn yesterday and headed for Jarablus. Ankara says they launched a raid to rid the city of the Islamic State after it sent a deadly bomber to a Turkish wedding near the border last week. Turkey says the offensive is aimed at cleansing the area of all terrorists, but it's more complicated than that. Jarablus hugs the Euphrates River and was the last stronghold of Islamic State in this area, which is otherwise widely controlled by the Kurdish militias PYD and YPG. ISIS was the only thing preventing the Kurds from having a large autonomous area on both sides of the river, and this is exactly what the Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan wants to prevent. Erdogan even said so. It's called Operation Euphrates Shield, and they are being supported by Syrian rebels backed by the Turks. The Kurdish fighters know very well what Erdogan is trying to achieve. They have warned the Turks not to strike against them and vowed they would not sit idly by and be attacked.
Once this tiny land piece that we're talking about is somehow regained by PYD forces from Daesh, and then this brings the completion of the southern Kurdish belt.
U.S. Vice President Joe Biden arrived in Turkey yesterday in a public show of support following the failed coup. The Turks know that America is allied with the Kurds in Syria, but they want Washington to secure promises from the Kurds that they will pull back and not resist the invading Turkish forces. And Biden agreed.
We have made it absolutely clear to the elements that were part of the Syrian Democratic Forces, the YPG that participated, that they must move back across the river. They cannot, will not, and under no circumstances get American support if they do not keep that commitment, period.
In this complicated war, the Russian-backed Assad regime can only sit back and watch the Turks invade Syria to strike at everyone's foe, the Islamic State. OSullivan for IBA News.
Back in the studio is Amos Asael, senior columnist for the Jerusalem Post, to wrap up this week's events. Amos, welcome back.
Hi, Lon.
We just saw an item about Turkey's invasion of Syria. Is it attacking ISIS together with the international coalition, or is this really about squashing the Kurds?
Oh, it certainly has joined the international cause concerning ISIS ever since the recent attacks that it has endured that came from ISIS by its own admission. But having said that, The more substantive goal from Turkey's viewpoint is indeed the Kurdish situation. For them, the scenario whereby a Kurdish continuum sprawls from Iraq through Syria into Turkey proper is a nightmare, and they're out to thwart this. And the news is not only that they've gone to the extent of actually invading Syria in order to prevent this, but that America is backing them in this.
Well, Israel has historically supported the Kurds to a certain extent, but it's been rather quiet on this issue. Why do you think that might be?
First of all, the Kurds that Israel once upon a time openly supported were Iraq's Kurds. It refrained from doing the same thing about Iran's Kurds and also about Turkey's Kurds and also about Syria's Kurds. It focused on Iraq because Iraq was in a situation in its own right, and that too was only back in the 60s. Since then, Israel's relationship with the Kurds has been much more quiet, as it remains today, even though it is reportedly thriving. Concerning the current situation, it certainly will not provoke Turkey, even regardless of the recent rapprochement between the countries, and it will also leave the Syrian Kurds to their own devices, and the Syrian Kurds will therefore have to, from here on, very carefully manage their situation, because everything that was opportune to them until now in the wake of the Syrian war is now changing, and not for the better as far as they're concerned.
Well, where does this leave the Syrian Kurds then, with both the Assad regime and ISIS, Turkey, all fighting against them?
They need to be pragmatic to display some of the pragmatism that ISIS did not display. They need to look for allies, and the allies are out there. They can get American backing, provided that they avoid provoking the Turkish government, and I think that's feasible from their viewpoint.
But we've said that any establishment of a territorial presence along the border is already a provocation for Turkey.
No, west of the Euphrates, Turkey is fine with them. Their problem, they say for the record, and it makes sense also, is if the Syrian Kurds also proceed now east of the Euphrates and thus create a potential continuum to the rest of the Kurds.
Okay, well, in the same context, Iran has granted Russia permission to park its planes on its soil, but now is angry at Moscow for using an Iranian airbase in order to attack Syria. What is this kerfuffle about?
The statement is face-saving. What is happening strategically is that Iran needs badly Russian arms, and the Russians are more than happy to sell them the arms they need. They need big quantities and they need low prices. And both of these the Russians happily supply. That is why it goes without saying that the Iranians are going to dance with this wolf. The wolf, the Russian wolf, from their viewpoint, demands in return, among other things, strategic presence. And the Iranians have granted that grudgingly. Now that the presence has become known, they want to make believe that they did not compromise their sovereignty and pride.
Okay, well, moving from the Syrian plunder to another issue, the Polish government has approved legislation that would punish people for up to 3 years in jail for using the term Polish death camps or ascribing any responsibility for Nazi atrocities to people to Polish people. What is Israel's position on this matter?
Well, unlike what some people might reflexively suspect, this is not exactly about Jews or anti-Semitism. This is about Polish pride. Granted, it is being done in a way that others in the West find suspicious and also impractical. When governments begin to tell historians what to write and what not to write, we reflexively think of Orwell in 1984. That's true. But the Polish motivation in this case, setting aside its practicality, stems from a deep sense of insecurity that the Polish people now share in the wake of their being wedged between a very restless Russia to their east that has invaded nearby Ukraine and with whom they have a very, very troubled two-century history, and to their west, they're wedged by the Germans, who are prodding Poland, along with the rest of the European Union, to admit Middle Eastern immigration that they do not want, and that creates there a deep sense of insecurity that 10 months ago
all the same, it's not all about anti-Semitism, but there is a relevant angle here.
It brought to power a very conservative government, and this is part of what it's done.
And in terms of Israel's response to Polish attempts to shake off...
remain quiet. It's not about us.
Okay, thank you very much, Olmert.
Thank you, Alon.
The Syrian government and the Islamic State used chemical weapons in attacks in Syria in 2014 and 2015, a report submitted to the United Nations has concluded. The report, compiled by investigators of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and the UN Joint Investigative Mechanism, was handed to UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon yesterday. Findings revealed that Syrian regime troops used chlorine gas in 2 attacks, and the Islamic State has used mustard gas. The joint investigative team focused on 9 attacks in 7 areas in Syria, but was unable to reach a conclusion in 6 cases, saying at least 3 warranted further investigation. The US ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, called the use of chemical weapons barbaric and urged the Security Council to take strong and swift action against those responsible. The Council will convene next week to discuss the issue. Australian police insist there is no indication of any form of radicalisation or any particular motive in relation to the Frenchman who stabbed a young British woman to death and critically injured another man while reportedly shouting Allahu Akbar. Police are investigating whether the suspect had a romantic interest in his victim, but stress there is no indication of such a scenario, suggesting that he might have been high on cannabis. The suspect, 29-year-old Ismail Ayad, allegedly bit a police officer in the leg after his psychiatric assessment and is expected to face charges shortly. A delegation of British Conservative MPs is visiting Israel, the 9th expedition by the Conservative Friends of Israel since last year's general elections. I spoke earlier to Conor Burns, MP for Bournemouth West, who is confident that British-Israeli relations will only improve.
Well, the big takeaways, I think, are on the economic front, what an incredible, dynamic and innovative place Israel has become since my first visit here back in 1997. And I think on the second major takeaway would be how depressingly intractable the relationship appears to be between Israel and the Palestinians, and how Israel's security must remain an absolute priority. It's a sole absolute priority in the years ahead.
How do you expect that your visit might influence British foreign policy when you get back home?
Well, I think it's very helpful. It's one of the great benefits of the Conservative Friends of Israel to bring parliamentarians out and put them on the ground so they actually start to be able to visualise some of the things that we debate back in the British Parliament. So, for example, the other day we were able to go up to the furthest northern border of Israel and see the intersection between Israel, Syria and Lebanon, and actually see what is going on right on Israel's border, where we actually saw rocket fire inside Syria.
But in terms of policy, do you see your visit leading to specific policy recommendations?
I think it's helpful for us when we're able to talk to Foreign Office ministers back home and relate to them perhaps some of the things that they're not allowed to see within the confines of the Foreign Office. So, for example, yesterday we were able to go in to the West Bank. Now, I would hope that our ministers in future will go in and see what's going on in there. So it helps us almost be eyes and ears for the British government in telling them and telling ministers directly what's actually going on the ground.
Mr. Burns, looking at the political context, how might we expect the Brexit vote to impact, if at all, on Britain's relations with Israel?
Look, Britain and Israel enjoy some of the closest relations between any 2 countries in the world. We are not just Conservative friends of Israel, Britain is a friend of Israel. And I think one of the great things about the vote that the United Kingdom took to leave the European Union, it's not just us leaving the European Union, it's actually us rejoining the rest of the world. It gives Britain a flexibility and adaptability and agility to negotiate bilateral trade arrangements, and I would hope, and I'm certainly picking it up here, that people in Israel hope it too, that Israel will be one of the first countries when we're outside the European Union that we will sign a free trade agreement with, and that will be in Israel's interest and in Britain's interest.
Former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, who is serving a 19-month jail sentence for bribery and obstruction of justice in the Holy Land affair, has applied for early release. The parole board is expected to review his application on the 25th of December. A report on Channel 10 quoted unnamed prison service officials saying they are not expected to oppose his early release after serving 2/3 of his sentence already. However, his parole could still be rejected because of the standing court cases against him. The Supreme Court has yet to discuss the former Prime Minister's appeal concerning his conviction and sentencing in the Talansky cash envelopes affair after the Jerusalem District Court sentenced him to 8 months. The state prosecutor is also appealing a suspended sentence handed to Olmert concerning breach of trust in the investment centre case. The first lawsuit against Unilever Israel, the company responsible for marketing salmonella-infected breakfast cereal, has been filed at the Haifa District Court. Attorney Eitan Peleg said he submitted a 70 million shekel suit against the company last week on behalf of a 15-year-old boy who was hospitalized for a number of days, suffering from a salmonella infection after consuming contaminated cornflakes. According to Peleg, the company refused to accept responsibility after being contacted by the teenager's father, insisting that the contaminated cornflakes had never left their production facility in Arad. The health ministry earlier this month declared Unilever had acted negligently in the affair that led to the tainted cereal being sold in supermarkets. Tourism Minister Yariv Levin is calling for Brussels Airlines to be banned from Israel for reportedly refusing to serve chalva made in the West Bank, but the airline insists there's no boycott. Yesterday, Ynet reported that the Belgian-based airline had stopped serving chalva made by Achva in the Barkan Industrial Park in Samaria, and that it did so because of pressure from the boycott movement, and this following reports in Belgian media citing pro-Palestinian activists. But a spokeswoman for the airline claimed this was all one big misunderstanding, and that the company had never ordered the sesame product in the first place, that it was delivered in error, and that this mistake was only noticed when a customer did indeed complain of the snack's provenance. She emphasized that the airline, which flies 11 weekly flights to and from Tel Aviv, remains very loyal to Israel, which represents an important market. But that didn't stop the tourism minister saying that Belgian Airlines has no place in Israeli skies and should be deleted from Ben Gurion's flight boards. Children at 2 Satmar Hasidic day camps in New York were led on demonstrations against Israel, according to recently published footage. The children chanted "Israeli government, shame on you," and threw eggs at a car representing the motorcade of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The ultra-Orthodox Satmar sect, based in Williamsburg and Kiryas Joel, remains staunchly anti-Zionist, believing that the establishment of Jewish sovereignty in Israel must await the arrival of the Messiah. This comes as a Yiddish-language decree by Satmar leadership has surfaced, warning that it is dangerous and against the Torah for women to acquire a university education, and that the movement will refuse to give employment to any woman with a degree, lest any secular influence penetrate their holy environment. Israeli scientist Dr. Aviv Ofer of the Weizmann Institute was among a team of scientists from 9 countries who discovered a new planet remarkably like Earth, a mere stone's throw away in interstellar terms. Proxima b, 1.3 times larger than Earth, takes just 11.2 days to orbit Proxima Centauri, which is the nearest star to our own. It exists in the so-called habitable zone, where temperatures are just right to make liquid surface water a possibility if the planet transpires to have an atmosphere. The new planet could prove fertile ground for the mass relocation of human civilization when our sun finally dies in 5 billion years, if space travel becomes sufficiently advanced to allow Earthlings to brave the 4.2 light-year, that's 25 trillion mile, commute. Proxima is expected to continue burning for several trillion years, almost 1,000 times longer than the remaining lifetime of our sun, giving future humans ample time before needing to relocate again. Russian billionaire Yuri Milner has already announced plans to send a fleet of miniature spaceships to search for alien life there, in a project backed by Professor Stephen Hawking that aims to sail 1-gram laser-propelled nanocrafts at 20% of the speed of light, arriving in a mere 20 years.
This is a planet in our neighborhood, and we will start thinking about how we can actually take a picture from somewhere else than on Earth. So maybe finally we send out a camera and actually take a picture, which would be the most spectacular thing I think we could think about. So finally, I'd like to close this with the bottom line that Proxima b is indeed our neighbor, so let us get used to it.
Moving to terrestrial travel, with summer holidays almost coming to a close, officials at Ben Gurion Airport today said a record 86,000 passengers are expected to land or take off in a total of 497 flights at Ben Gurion Airport today, making it the busiest day of the summer. Since the beginning of last month, almost 4 million passengers have passed through the airport. This peak represents an increase on what was previously reported as the busiest day of the year, when 83,000 passengers transited through the international airport. In finance, the shekel is mixed in foreign trading, the pound still just shy of 5 shekels, and the stock market is ending the week slightly down. weather, temperatures will remain warm but stable tomorrow, with a slight rise to unseasonable heights for the end of August on Saturday. And that's all for the news this week. I'm afraid we'll be back on Sunday. Until then, from the IBA team, it's a Shabbat Shalom live from Jerusalem.